Yes, good afternoon, everyone. So the topic is use of discretion in courts. Uh, to start with, I do not want to share the research that I have just made, but the purpose of this talk is to rake up a debate so that after you go back listening to the things which I have said, you come out with new perspectives about what I am speaking about. The To start with, see what the purpose of law. One of the important aims of law is to achieve a disciplined or a common and equal manner of behavior and action pattern among the citizens in a given set of circumstances. The lawmaking authority, for that purpose, to achieve that purpose, actually creates or enacts rules and statutes defining the rights, liabilities, defining the obligations, enabling and compelling duties, and providing remedies and other such measures. The everyday exercise of every advocate in the nation in preparing and presenting one's side to the court makes him understand that how meek he is, especially when he cannot assure to himself or to his litigants the sure outcome in an unvaried manner. Similarly, the judges, the litigants, and the advocates, all of us have a little difficulty in coming to a conclusion as to, in a given set of facts, applying the very same statutory provisions, what would be the result. One cannot very obviously and perfectly tell that this would be the outcome of the case, because there are several ways in which a particular matter could be adjudicated. Now, the innumerable ways in which the humans conduct themselves limit the power of the lawmaking authority to bring into the statute book a code of discipline that could be applied to all in all such circumstances and cases. And therefore, the statute book is just a compilation of certain rules to discipline the behavior or action of the citizenry in commensality, and it cannot be a individual specific rule. The task of the interpreter or the juror or the arbitrator or the judge, or I can say the institution of courts, is to add to the building blocks of the process of the application of this statute for the adjudication of a specific case, in order to bring about the same effect in that specific case also, which the statute requires to bring about in the commensality. The unavoidable task of adding a few or more building blocks in this process of adjudication, even while applying the statutory rule or law, this task involves a certain undefined and unknown and unchanneled power. This power, I call it, is the discretion of the court or the arbitrator or the judge. And this is unavoidably used in courts by the judges for the purpose of achieving what could be called the just decision or a just adjudication of every case, every individual case. Now, there have been attempts in the philosophy of law in various jurisprudences in various countries as to how this discretion which is exercised by the courts or judges be channelized or be guided. The legislation has, in our country and in other countries also, not been able to actually define in precise words as to how the discretion is to be guided when such discretion is, how the judges are to be guided when such discretion is to be used. A very wide range of options are made available to the court, and the details of such options are also not made known through the legislations. Therefore, wherever any adjudication is being made, how the judges have to decide becomes a difficult task. Now, in India, there are very few legislations which have said that certain matters permit the courts or the judges to use their discretion in adjudicating the cases. Now, the chunk of the load is taken by the judiciary itself in giving certain guidelines in which manner the judges can actually be guided while deciding cases. I can, in short, I can only point out a few such aspects of law where the judiciary has culled out certain guidelines and has come out with certain considerations as to adjudicating particular cases where there is discretion at all available to the court. Broadly speaking, the aspects on which I would be presenting before you, the principles which have been judicially evolved are inherent powers of the civil courts, which are generally exercised by the civil courts, the inherent powers of the civil courts to issue injunctions other than those which are addressed or which are issued under Order 39 at Rule 1 and 2 of the Code of Civil Procedure. The other aspects are the High Court's inherent power of quashing of criminal proceedings, then quashing of criminal proceedings based on compromise by the victim, then grant or refusal of bail to an accused. What are the principles regarding grant of anticipatory and regular bail? What are the principles regarding cancellation of the bail which is already granted? Then how the discretion is to be exercised while issuing writs by the High Court under Article 226 of the Constitution of India and by the Supreme Court under Article 32, and what is the distinction between the two powers under Article 226 and Article 32 of the Constitution of India. Then, with regard to grant or refusal of the special leave to appeal by the Supreme Court under Article 136, with regard to the declarations and specific reliefs under the Specific Relief Act, a decree for specific performance, grant of interim orders in appeals and revisions, award of sentence of punishment, award of costs in litigations. These are the broad aspects. These are the broad aspects in which I am going to highlight what are the principles judicially evolved. Though award of sentence is a separate topic, and therefore I am not dwelling more on the aspect of award of sentence of punishment. I would start with how the courts have described or have understood the term discretion through their various judgments. I may refer to a very few judgments. The list of those citations I will later on also circulate. In the case of Babu Singh versus the state of UP, reported in 1978, the words of Benjamin Cardozo were relied upon. They were reiterated. It is held that the judge, even when he is free, is still not wholly free. He is not to innovate at pleasure. He is not to yield to sentiments or to vague and unregulated benevolence. What is stated is he is to exercise a discretion which is informed by tradition, by analogy, by a disciplined system, and to achieve order in social life. The Supreme Court also has relied upon the wordings of Lord Camden, saying that the discretion of a judge is the law of tyrants. It is always unknown. It is different in different men. It is casual, and it depends upon constitutional temper and passion. In the best, it is oftentimes caprice. In the worst, it is every vice, folly, and passion to which human nature is liable. Now, the Supreme Court also takes note of the fact that vesting of discretion is the unspoken but inescapable silent command of our judicial system. However, it is stated that it must be governed by rule and not by humor. It must not be arbitrary, vague, and fanciful, but legal and regular. What is also taken note of is that an appeal to a judge's discretion is an appeal to his judicial conscience. The discretion must be exercised not in opposition to, but in accordance with the established principles of law. A judgment of the Gujarat High Court in the case of State of Gujarat versus Ramesh Chauhan takes note of this. It says judicial discretion must be exercised with vigilance and circumspection according to justice, common sense, and sound judgment. The discretion is to know through law what is just. In Nabi Kishore Sahu versus East India Arms Company, the Orissa High Court also took note of this, and it said that the word discretion means judicial discretion exercised according to something like a settled rule and in such a way as to prevent the defendant doing a wrongful act. It is a sound and reasonable discretion to be reasonably exercised having regard to all circumstances of a particular case. Having understood what discretion is all about, the most the courts have been using discretion while exercising inherent powers. Now, inherent power is to be understood in this way. In a case reported in 1992 SEC in Janata Dal versus H.S. Chowdhury, quoting a Latin maxim, the Supreme Court says the rule of inherent power has its source in that Latin maxim, which means that when the law gives anything to anyone, it also gives all those things without which the thing itself could not exist. The criminal courts and the civil courts both are clothed with inherent powers to pass such orders as may be necessary for the ends of justice. Now, the Supreme Court mentions that the power, though is unrestricted and undefined, should not be capriciously or arbitrarily exercised, but should be exercised in appropriate cases ex debito justitiae, that is, to do real and substantial justice, for the administration of which alone the courts exist. Section 482 of the Code of Criminal Procedure is one such provision which saves the inherent power of the High Court in all criminal matters. It is held by the Supreme Court that Section 482, the powers under Section 482 are very wide, and the very plenitude of the power requires great caution in its exercise. The courts must be very careful to see that its decision in exercise of this power is based on sound principles. But what are those principles? There are many such principles. I would be highlighting only a very few which are little startling. In the case of Amit Kumar versus Ramesh Chandar, a few principles are held to be necessary consideration for the purpose of exercise of this jurisdiction with regard to quashing of the charge either in the exercise of jurisdiction under the powers of Section 397 of the Code of Criminal Procedure or under Section 482. What is stated is that as held, the power under Section 482 of exercising inherent jurisdiction should be exercised very sparingly and with circumspection, and that too in the rarest of rare cases. Whether the uncontroverted allegations as made from the record of the case and the documents submitted therewith prima facie establish the offence or not is a criteria, and if that criteria is fulfilled, the High Court under Section 482 of the Code may quash the proceedings. If the allegations are so patently absurd and inherently improbable that no prudent person can ever reach such a conclusion, or where the basic ingredients of the offence are not satisfied, then the court may interfere. The court has said, see, what I am exactly trying to explain is that Section 482 of the Code of Criminal Procedure is worded very loosely. It says to secure the ends of justice for the purpose of enabling the orders of the court to be enforced or to prevent abuse of process of court, the High Court can exercise its inherent power. Now, what exactly can it do and it cannot do is what the judicial principles have been evolved through these judgments. So, there are certain guidelines stated as to when this power could be exercised, and this is what I was trying to explain, that where the uncontroverted allegations of the record do not establish any offense at all, then the High Court can say that yes, the proceedings should be quashed and the trial need not be continued. If the allegations are so patently absurd also, the High Court can do it. But the caution is that no meticulous examination of the evidence is needed for considering whether the case would end in conviction or not. For the purpose of preventing a patent miscarriage of justice or for correcting some grave error, the powers under 1482 can be issued. Where there is an express bar enacted in any law or in any specific law or the code, then 482 can be exercised and the prosecution can be scuttled. The court has a duty, it is stated by the Supreme Court, that the court has a duty to balance the freedom of a person and the right of the complainant or the prosecution to investigate and prosecute the offender. So, if there is a process, if the process of the court is used for some ultimate or oblique motive by a complainant, then the court can always interfere and stall the proceedings and quash the entire proceedings. Where the allegations appeared from the documents constitute a civil wrong with no element of criminality and does not satisfy the basic ingredients of a criminal offense, the court may justify quashing of the charge. The court has to examine the facts and the material on record, and if it finds that there is sufficient material on the basis of which the case could end in conviction, the court is bound to continue the prosecution. But the court is not concerned with evidence at this stage. It is only the allegations which, taken as a whole to be true, as stated in the complaint and the other material available, if they amount to an abuse of the process of the court itself leading to injustice, then the court will exercise inherent power to quash the criminal proceedings. However, a full-fledged inquiry or appreciation of evidence is not required at this stage, is what the Supreme Court says. The quashing of a charge or quashing of a proceeding is an exception to the rule of continuous prosecution. Basically, whenever there is an FIR lodged, whenever the criminal law is set into motion, the prosecution has to end in either acquittal or conviction by the process of trial and by a judgment of the court. Quashing is in fact intervening with this continuous process, and therefore these are the broad guidelines which are given by the Supreme Court, where section 482 is to be exercised, where the court feels that the prosecution amounts to abuse of the process of the court, or that the interest of justice favors the quashing of the proceedings. And as I stated, ex debito justitiae is the basis on which inherent powers are exercised, either in criminal side or on the civil side also. In another judgment in Gyan Singh versus State of Punjab, referring to various earlier judgments, in the case of Emperor versus Khwaja Nazir Ahmad and several such judgments, Lala Jairam Das versus Emperor, passed by the Privy Council, the courts have held that for the inherent power under section 482 of the new code 1973, which is equivalent to the earlier provision of section 561A of the earlier Code of Criminal Procedure. The inherent power cannot be invoked in regard to matters which are directly covered by the specific provisions of the code. Now here is the dispute. The Criminal Procedure Code makes several provisions with regard to certain procedures. Now, whether the inherent power of the court can be exercised in contradistinction to certain provisions which are available in the code, or it should be exercised beyond such powers which are already prescribed in the code, or could it be exercised to infringe the provisions which are already made in the code. The Supreme Court took note of such few such anomalies, and this is what it said: it cannot be invoked in regard to matters which are directly covered by the specific provisions of the code. However, the ruling of the Supreme Court when it comes to exercise of inherent power by the civil court is concerned is slightly different. But so far as quashing is concerned, or any other proceedings relating to criminal jurisdiction is concerned, this is what the Supreme Court has held. It has held that it cannot be invoked if its exercise would be inconsistent with any of the specific provisions of the code. It is only if the matter in question is not covered by any specific provision of the code that the inherent powers under 482 can be exercised. Now, it is stated in one judgment in the case of State of Karnataka versus L. Muniswamy, a 3 judges bench decision of the Supreme Court states broadly like this. It says that the saving of the High Court's inherent power is designed to achieve a salutary public purpose, which is that a court proceeding ought not to be permitted to degenerate into a weapon of harassment or persecution. In a criminal case, the veiled object behind a lame prosecution, the very nature of the material on which the structure of the prosecution rests, and the like would justify the High Court in quashing the proceedings in the interest of justice. The ends of justice are higher than the ends of mere law, though justice has to be got administered according to the laws made by the legislature. This is the observation of the Supreme Court. In Madhu Limaye versus the State of Maharashtra, a very famous judgment of a 3 judges bench, it was again one question arose there whether the inherent powers under section 482 of the Code of Criminal Procedure could be invoked for quashing an interlocutory order. Section 397 subsection 2 of the Code of Criminal Procedure says that interlocutory orders cannot be challenged in a revision. So there is an express bar. Now the 3 judges bench decision dealt with a situation where the code prescribes an express bar. However, whether section 482 can be still exercised or not. It held that the power under section 482 is not to be resorted to if there is a specific provision in the code for the redress of the grievance of the aggrieved party. However, it also held that it should be exercised very sparingly to prevent the abuse of process of any court or otherwise to secure the ends of justice. Then it said it should not be exercised as against the express bar of law engrafted in any other provision of the code. And so on, it dealt with the particular facts of that case, and it held that section 482 is pervasive and it should not subvert legal interdicts written into the same code. Certain other earlier judgments in the case of Raj Kapoor versus the state and others, and such other judgments were referred to. And finally, it held that the policy of law is clear that interlocutory orders, pure and simple, should not be taken up to the High Court, resulting in unnecessary litigation and delay. At the other extreme, final orders are clearly capable of being considered in exercise of inherent power if glaring injustice stares the court in the face. And it said in between is a tertium quid, and it said that where it is more than a purely interlocutory order and less than a final disposal, the powers under section 482 can be exercised. And finally, it upheld this observation that the answer is obvious that the bar will not operate to prevent the abuse of process of the court and to secure the ends of justice. So therefore, what it held was, though an interlocutory order cannot be challenged in a revision under 397 before the High Court or the Sessions Court, the High Court, to prevent the abuse of process of court, can still intervene and quash an interlocutory order in a proceeding if it is not of a purely interlocutory nature but affects the rights of the accused or any parties thereto. Then in another case, in the case of Simrikhia versus Dolly Mukherjee and Chhabi Mukherjee, a peculiar situation arose before the court as to whether a second petition under section 482 could be made or not. Then again the court culled down what are the principles relating to the exercise of power under section 482, and it said that it cannot be exercised to do something which is expressly barred under the code. And finally, the observations were that the inherent powers, however, as much are controlled by the principle and precedent as are its express powers by statute. If a matter is covered by an express letter of law, the court cannot give a go-by to the statutory provisions and instead evolve a new provision in the garb of inherent jurisdiction. So this is what the courts have stated. And then there are several other judgments in the case of Dharampal versus Ramshri and Arun Shankar Shukla and G. Sagar Suri versus the state of UP, where the jurisdiction under section 482 was discussed, and it held that the High Court is not to examine the matter superficially, and it has to give effect, the power or the jurisdiction under section 482 is to give effect to an order under the code or to prevent an abuse of the process of court and to otherwise secure the ends of justice. The inherent power should not be exercised to stifle a legitimate prosecution. What happens is, we advocates normally approach the High Court under section 482 and then start arguing on the facts and the logical acceptance of the content of the complaints, and then say that this is logically unacceptable, and therefore we request the High Court to quash the proceedings. So this is the caution given by the Supreme Court, saying that the inherent power cannot be exercised to stifle a legitimate prosecution. Therefore, the consideration of the case has to be not superficial, but it has to be a very serious consideration of all the facts and circumstances of the case. They have said that we have largely inherited the provisions of inherent powers from English jurisprudence. Therefore, the principles decided by the English courts would be of relevance for us. It is generally agreed that the Crown courts had inherent powers to protect its power process from abuse, and the English courts have also used inherent power to achieve the same objective. So what the Supreme Court indicates is that the principles governing the exercise of power by the English courts is broadly applicable in India also, though there are certain departures made in various cases. The leading judgment in the case of state of Haryana versus Bhajanlal, reported in 1992, in fact enumerates what are the considerations for the purpose of exercise of power under section 482 for quashing the criminal proceedings. It has said that, taken at their face value and accepted in its entirety, if the allegations made in the complaint or the FIR do not prima facie constitute any offence, then the proceedings have to be quashed. Then again it says that if the allegations do not disclose a cognizable offence, then also the proceedings have to be quashed. It has said that if it only constitutes a non-cognizable offence, then the investigation is permitted by the police officer without an order of a magistrate. However, if the allegations are so absurd and inherently improbable, then it is a sufficient ground for quashing the proceedings. The same principles which I had just now mentioned at the beginning are the ones which are reiterated in this judgment also. Now, so far as the cases where a criminal prosecution is launched and thereafter the victim and the accused, or the complainant and the accused persons, enter into a compromise, they feel that it would be appropriate for them to close the litigation to stop any heartburning among them. So there are certain provisions, certain crimes which are classified as non-compoundable under the code, and certain of them are compoundable. Those which are compoundable can be compounded either with the permission of the court or without the permission of the court. But the difficulty arises as to when the victim or the complainant and the accused persons enter into a settlement in cases which are non-compoundable. So the Supreme Court in this very case of Gyanchand versus State of Punjab held that yes, the power under section 482 can be exercised for the purpose of quashing a prosecution if there is a settlement between the parties, the victim, complainant on one side and the accused. It said, before exercise of such power, the High Court must have due regard to the nature and gravity of the crime. Heinous and serious offences of mental depravity or offences like murder, rape, dacoity, etc. cannot be fittingly quashed, even though the victim or victim's family and the offender have settled the dispute. Such offences, the Supreme Court says, are not private in nature and have serious impact on the society. Similarly, any compromise between the victim and offender in relation to the offences under special statutes like the Prevention of Corruption Act or the offences committed by public servants while working in that capacity cannot provide for any basis for quashing criminal proceedings involving such offences. So therefore, criminal prosecutions which can be classified as, though all criminal cases are one which in which the interest of the state is involved, however, certain cases can be treated as of a private nature, and certain of them can be treated as of the nature which affect the society at large. In cases which are of private nature, the compromise can be accepted and the proceedings can be quashed, is what the Supreme Court has held in that matter. It has held that the compromise between the offender and the victim, the possibility of conviction is remote and bleak, and the continuation of criminal case would put accused to great oppression and prejudice, and extreme injustice would be caused to him by not quashing the criminal case despite full and complete settlement and compromise with the victim, are certain considerations which have to be kept in mind before the criminal court quashes these proceedings based on compromise or settlement. There are two more judgments subsequently in the case of Narinder Singh versus State of Punjab, where the Supreme Court in the case of Narinder Singh held that a prosecution under section 307 cannot be quashed even if there is a settlement between the parties. However, in one more judgment subsequently, it held that under section 307 also, if the injury was private to that particular individual and it was of a private nature, then the settlement could be accepted and the proceedings could be quashed. Now, because of this apparent conflict between the two decisions in the case of Narinder Singh versus State of Punjab and the State of Rajasthan versus Shambhu Kevat, the Supreme Court in a recent decision in the case of State of Madhya Pradesh versus Lakshmi Narayan has again reiterated the powers of the Criminal High Court under section 482 and has stated under which circumstances the powers can be exercised. It is stated that it would be open to the High Court to go by the nature of injury sustained, whether such injury is inflicted on the vital or delicate part of the body, the nature of the weapons used, etc. However, such an exercise by the High Court would be permissible only after the evidence is collected, after investigation and the charge sheet is filed or the charge is framed, and or during the trial. Such exercise is not permissible when the matter is still under investigation, and therefore the ultimate conclusion which was made in the case of Narinder Singh should be read harmoniously and as a whole, and the circumstances have to be considered as a whole. Finally, the bench held that what is required is to consider the antecedents of the accused, the conduct of the accused, namely whether the accused was absconding and why he was absconding, how he had managed with the complainant to enter into a compromise, and thereafter to decide whether to quash the proceedings based on such compromise or not. So far as the powers of inherent, so far as the jurisdiction of exercising inherent powers for quashing the proceedings is concerned, I found that these are the few judgments which would reiterate the guidelines as to how the various courts in the country should exercise powers in various circumstances. After another 5 or 10 minutes, I would be keeping open this as a discussion, and we will discuss about specific problems arising before the court. Now, so far as anticipatory bail, grant of bail, whether anticipatory or regular, is definitely discretionary. Now, the Supreme Court, in a very recent decision in Sushila Agarwal versus the State NCT of Delhi, decided on 29 January 2020, has taken note of certain anomalies in the earlier judgments, where anticipatory bails in few courts in the country were being granted for a limited time, were being granted on very serious conditions being fulfilled by the accused, or there were certain cases where the court felt that the party shall first surrender and only then seek the regular bail. Such orders were passed when applications under 438 seeking anticipatory bail were made. Therefore, the court held that in what circumstances anticipatory bail can be sought for. It said that there has to be an apprehension, and that apprehension has to be based on concrete facts and not vague allegations. And such apprehension has to be relatable to a specific offense, or the particulars of the offense have to be stated. And in relation to that offense, the apprehension has to be a real apprehension of being arrested. The court in this judgment has also clarified that it is not necessary that there must be an FIR lodged. It is enough if the applicant is able to substantiate that he has a real apprehension of being arrested with regard to a specific offense without there being an FIR actually being lodged. In that very judgment, the Supreme Court said that 438 does not compel or oblige courts to impose conditions limiting the relief in terms of time or upon filing of FIR. The nature of the offense, the role of the person, the likelihood of his influencing the course of investigation or tampering with the evidence, including intimidating the witnesses, his likelihood of fleeing from justice, such as leaving the country, etc., are the considerations which have to be taken note of. The nature and gravity of the offences, the role attributed to the applicant, and the facts of the case altogether have to be assessed before the court decides whether the anticipatory bail must be granted or not. Anticipatory bail is a term which has come into vogue by user, and it is not found in the statute book. In the statute book, under section 438, there is only bail in anticipation of arrest. However, we loosely use the term anticipatory bail, but the actual meaning of that particular provision is that wherever the police officer arrests a person, then the court has already granted an order that he must be released on bail. The conduct and behavior of the accused continue after the filing of the charge sheet till end of the trial. This is a very necessary condition which the Supreme Court takes note of for the purpose of granting the anticipatory bail or to refuse the bail. What it says is that, however, anticipatory bail should not be granted as a blanket order. It should be confined to the offense or the incident for which the apprehension of arrest is sought. Many a times we have seen that we make applications saying that a particular applicant shall not be arrested at all, without mentioning as to what offense he is apprehending the arrest about. Therefore, the Supreme Court has taken note of this fact and has now clarified about this particular aspect of the situation. Then it said the earlier principles enunciated in the case of Sibia regarding limited custody or deemed custody, etc., shall be followed yet. So this is what the Supreme Court has said in this very recent decision. Now what it says is the police officer or the investigating agency can always move the court concerned which had granted the anticipatory bail in the first instance for a direction under section 439 subsection 2 in the event of violation of any term or condition, or in the event of apprehension of the accused going absconding or non-cooperating during the investigation. So therefore, sometimes we have seen that the courts would reject an anticipatory bail, assuming that the accused may go absconding or he may violate certain conditions. The court has now clarified that that shall not be an apprehension in the mind of the court while granting the bail in all circumstances. If it feels that there is case made out for grant, it shall grant it. However, it will be always open to the investigating agency to again make an application for cancellation of such bail. And the grant of anticipatory bail is also held to be subject matter of an interference by the appellate court or the superior court. This is also now clarified, though there were earlier judgments clarifying this position, but this recent decision has reiterated this fact and the law. There were earlier judgments in the case of Mehtre and in the case of KL Verma and Nirul Jeet Kaur, etc., where they had said that the restrictive conditions cannot be imposed at all. But then in this judgment in Sushila Agarwal's case, the Supreme Court has overruled those earlier judgments so far as this aspect is concerned, and has held that such restrictive conditions or terms limiting the grant of occupancy of anticipatory bail to a period of time are hereby overruled. This is what the Supreme Court has said. However, some important observations are made in the conclusion. It said it would be useful to remind oneself that the right which the citizens cherish deeply are fundamental It is not the restrictions that are fundamental. Joseph Story, the great jurist and US Supreme Court judge, remarked that personal security and private property rest entirely upon the wisdom, the stability, and the integrity of the courts of justice. Now, so far as the regular bails are concerned, one judgment I may refer, which would again relate to the same principles for the purpose of grant of anticipatory bail. In the case of Masroor versus the state of UP, decided in the year 2009, the Supreme Court has again said that the relevant considerations for grant or refusal of regular bail are the nature of accusation and the severity of punishment in case of conviction and the nature of supporting evidence, reasonable apprehension of tampering with the witness or apprehension of threat to the complainant, and prima facie satisfaction of the court in support of the charge. However, again, in this case also it noted that there is no denying the fact that the liberty of an individual is precious and it is to be zealously protected by the courts. Nonetheless, such a protection cannot be absolute in every situation. The valuable right of liberty of an individual and the interest of the society in general has to be balanced. Liberty of a person accused of an offense would depend upon the exigencies of the case. It is possible that in a given situation the collective interest of the community may outweigh the right of the personal liberty to the individual concerned. So these philosophies basically are the ones which should weigh in the mind of the judge while he is granting bail or refusing the bail. Similarly, in few other recent decisions, in the case of Neeru Yadav versus state of UP, in the reported in the year 2015, referring to the earlier judgments of the Supreme Court in Ram Govind Upadhyay versus Sudarshan Singh, in Prahlad Singh Bhati versus NCT, again the same principles are reiterated as to what should be considered at the time of granting of bail. All these parameters which are now culled out by the Supreme Court in various decisions I would say, would not take away the discretion of the court, but would rather infuse more discretion with the court and would guide the court in a proper direction. Now there is a little bit of more certainty as to what would be the considerations before the court that the judge would look into for the purpose of granting or refusing a particular relief. So therefore, in India we have marched a little ahead when compared to the jurisprudence or when compared to the decision making process in countries like Israel or in countries like UK or in few other African countries like Ghana, etc., where the discretion of that particular judge and would be more exercised, and there are no set of guidelines issued by the legislature or even by the presidents which would make the judge not to consider a particular fact or to consider a particular fact. Therefore, in these kind of judgments which the Indian judiciary has been passing, the guidelines would necessarily be limiting the discretion in one sense, but also would be to say strengthening the power of the judges in exercising their discretion. So this is a very peculiar situation which we have brought in the country. Though legislature has not taken note of this fact that the judges have to exercise discretion every day in every case, still these kind of guidelines which are enumerated by the courts are not put in legislation or in the statute book by the parliamentarians. So we should wait. My personal view is that a situation must arrive where, as far as possible, guidelines must be put on record by the parliamentarians which would guide the institutions. Whereas we still see that when there are two different philosophies available to weave at a particular dispute, then the personal afflictions of a judge sitting would be influential in deciding the case. If I grow up with a particular philosophy in my mind, I would apply that philosophy in deciding a case when there is no guideline as such which would compel me to consider or not to consider particular aspects of the case. So to avoid such a situation, guidelines have to be put in the statute book by the parliamentarians. Now, in this judgment of the year 2015 in Neeru Yadav versus state of UP, the Supreme Court has culled out not less than some 8 criterias which have to be criterias or factors which should be considered by the court. at the time of grant of bail. It says whether there is any prima facie or reasonable ground to believe that the accused has committed the offence, then nature and gravity of the accusation, severity of the punishment in the event of conviction, danger of the accused absconding or fleeing if released on bail, character, behavior, means position and standing of the accused, likelihood of the offence being repeated, reasonable apprehension of the witness being influenced, and danger, of course, of justice being thwarted by grant of bail. So these are the guidelines which are again stated therein. While taking note of certain observations of the US court in the case of Barrett versus in the case of stated by the then Chief Justice Barrett, it said in an ordered society of mankind there is no such thing as unrestricted liberty, either of nations or of individuals. Liberty itself is the product of restraints. This is how the Supreme Court has taken note of and has stated about liberty. Now, this is with regard to grant or refusal of the bail at the first instance. Now, the question arises about the exercise of discretion at the stage of cancellation of bail. So, the Supreme Court in the case of State of Bihar versus Raj Ballabh Prasad in the year 2016 has taken note of its earlier judgments in the case of State versus Sanjay Gandhi, then Bhagirath Singh versus State of Gujarat, and few other judgments, and it has said rejection of bail when bail is applied is one thing and cancellation of bail already granted is quite another. It is easier to reject a bail is what the court has said, but it is difficult to cancel an already granted bail. So there are certain difficulties that the court will face when he is to decide with regard to cancellation of an already granted bail. What is stated by the Supreme Court is very cogent and overwhelming circumstances are necessary for an order seeking cancellation of the bail, and the trend today is towards granting bail because it is now well settled by a catena of decisions of this court that the power to grant bail is not to be exercised as if the punishment before trial is being imposed. A personal note, nowadays many of the judges sway away by the fact that the allegations in the complaint mention that there is a very heinous crime committed by the accused. Now, mere allegation of a very heinous crime being committed should not be the lone criteria to say that he should be behind the bars as if he is being punished before trial. And therefore, this is the observation of the Supreme Court that you are not punishing the person before trial. The purpose of bail is to see that his presence is secured before the court at the time of trial or at any other times when his presence is needed for doing justice. So the sometimes we forget the very purpose of bail itself. Bail in simple terms is a subject matter of torts, is a subject matter of law of contracts also. Bail is nothing but a guarantee that I am giving that I would secure the presence of another person. So therefore that's the purpose of bail. However, these are the considerations now which guide the court in granting or refusing bail. It is said once the discretion is exercised by the High Court on relevant considerations and bail is granted, the Superior Court would normally not interfere with such a discretion unless it is found that the discretion itself is exercised on extraneous considerations and or the relevant factors which need to be taken into account while exercising such a discretion are ignored or bypassed. So far as the criminal aspects of the discretion is concerned, I think I have touched various aspects of the case. So far as inherent powers of the civil court, section 151 again rests on the very same logic. I think I am taking too much of time, Nivedita. Sir, Hari sir, I am taking too much of time. Am I making...
Please go on. Please go on.
No, go on, Amit. Go on. Otherwise, we'll compel you to give one more lecture at least on this.
Yeah, I know that you don't want to be bored again.
Yes, please complete.
Okay.
No. You can do a lecture series on this. No problem.
All right. Now, so far as civil court's inherent powers, I would be touching only few aspects of it. Let me start with, or rather, let me start and end with this. The inherent power of the civil court to issue injunctions. Now, whether the civil court can issue injunctions exercising power under section 151 CPC. Now, that is a question because the parameters for grant of temporary injunctions or permanent injunctions have already been discussed by Nivedita earlier. Apart from Order 39, Rule 1 and 2 of CPC and Section 94, whether the civil court can issue injunctions of some different varied kinds exercising powers under 151. For that purpose, the Supreme Court, in the case of Manohar Lal Chopra versus Raj Bahadur Rao, this is as far back as in the year 1961-1962, it has said that the courts have inherent jurisdiction to issue temporary injunctions in circumstances which are not covered by the provisions of Order 39. It also says Section 151 of the Code make it clear that the inherent powers are not controlled by the provisions of the Code. There was a large debate in few judgments as to whether 151 is controlled by the other provisions of the Code or not. Like I said, while exercising powers under 482 of CRPC, the courts have said that 482 cannot be exercised in contradistinction with all the provisions which are already controlling the other provisions of the code. But here the Supreme Court in 1962 says that Section 151 of the code make it clear that the inherent powers are not controlled by the provisions of the code, but those powers are not to be exercised when their exercise may be in conflict with what has been expressly provided in the code or against the intentions of the legislature. So this is how the balance is made, that though it is not controlled by the code, but it is not to be exercised when there is a conflict with the other provisions in the code. The inherent powers are to be exercised by the court in very exceptional circumstances for which the code lays down no procedure. So this is where the inherent powers under 151 can be exercised, is what the Supreme Court says here. However, it says again great care and caution and considerations have to be made, and unless it's essential or absolutely essential for the ends of justice, such inherent powers should not be exercised. Now this judgment is very interesting because I find a minority view of Justice Shah in this judgment. In the minority view, he concurs with most of the observations of the majority view also. But what he says is inherent jurisdiction of the court to make order ex debito justitiae is undoubtedly affirmed by Section 151 of the code, but that jurisdiction cannot be exercised so as to nullify the provisions of the code. Where the code deals expressly with a particular matter, the provision should normally be regarded as exhaustive. This is what the minority opinion speaks of. So the majority view says Section 94 of the Code of Civil Procedure and Order 39 Rule 1 and 2 of the Code of Civil Procedure deal with the power to issue injunctions and the considerations for such grant. However, they don't limit the exercise of power to issue injunctions, and therefore 151 can be exercised, is what the majority says. But here the minority view says that where the court deals expressly with a particular matter, then it should be assumed that it has exhausted the entire subject in that particular provision itself, and therefore it ultimately holds that it is not open to the civil court, which is not a chartered high court, to exercise that power, ignoring the restriction imposed thereby in the purported exercise of its inherent jurisdiction. The minority opinion, while making this observation, takes note of a slight distinction between the ordinary civil courts or ordinarily established high courts and the chartered high courts. And it says that the chartered high courts had an inherent power to exercise ex debito justitiae. Probably the Calcutta High Court has succeeded to the Supreme Court of Calcutta, and therefore it has got certain different inherent powers altogether, which the other civil courts might not have got. So certain kind of observations and certain kind of observations are made by the minority while expressing the minority view with regard to the chartered high courts and the other high courts. It's a very interesting reading. I would advise you all to read that minority view first, because as Justice Chandrachud has said very recently, that some minority view opined in a judgment becomes the majority view subsequently in the subsequent years. So therefore minority views are as important as the majority views also. In K.K. Veluswamy versus N. Palaniswamy, a decision reported in 2011, the Supreme Court has said that it is summarizing the law with regard to Section 151. It says Section 151 is not a substantive provision. It merely recognizes the discretionary power inherent in every court as a necessary corollary for rendering justice. to do what is right and to undo what is wrong. Then it says they are section 151 recognizes and confirms that if the court does not expressly or impliedly cover any particular procedural aspect, then the exercise under section 151 can be made. It says that the power to do that which is prohibited by the law or the code by purported exercise of its power under 151 CPC or inherent power is not available. So in 2011, in fact, the Supreme Court is now affirming that minority view that was prevailing in 1962. Now here it again says that the court make use of special provisions of section 151 of code where the remedy or procedure is provided in the code, cannot make use of the special provisions of 151 where the remedy or procedure is provided in the code. Then it says it has to be, the powers have to be exercised not in any way to be in conflict with what has been expressly provided in the code or be against the intention of the legislature. Then it says how it has to be exercised. It says it has to be exercised with double caution, as there is no legislative guidance to deal with the inherent power. So inherent power only, the provision only says that the inherent power of the court is saved. The guide, there is no guide as to how the inherent power is to be exercised, and therefore the Supreme Court says that it has to be doubly cautious. The court has to be doubly cautious. Now coming to another aspect of the civil law, I found that this is a very important topic because the kind of litigation that is increasing in the country, this particular aspect of law would be a relevant aspect for everyone to now reconsider for the purpose of mitigating the number of pendencies in the country. That is, the topic is costs in civil litigation. I am referring to only hardly 2 judgments of the Supreme Court where they are making some observations with regard to the costs. In the case of Sanjeev Kumar Jain versus Raghubir Sharan Charitable Trust, decided in 2011, Justice R.V. Ravindran in the Supreme Court refers to the judgment of Ashok Kumar Mittal and says that in Ashok Kumar Mittal, this court pointed out the present system of levying meager costs in civil matters and in many matters no costs at all. And it says that it is wholly unsatisfactory and does not act as a deterrent to vexatious or luxury litigation born out of ego or greed or resorted to as a buying time tactic. And it says the Western models of awarding actual and more realistic costs is a matter that requires to be debated and that should engage the attention of Law Commission of India. Therefore, it says though we cannot go beyond what has been permitted by the code, but it should take the attention of the Law Commission. It refers to section 35 and 35 capital A of the Code of Civil Procedure, and it says that the provisions of section 35, 35A do not in any way affect the wide discretion vested in the High Court in exercise of its inherent power to award costs in the interest of justice in appropriate civil cases. However, it also says it is subject to such conditions and limitations as may be prescribed. So it takes note of 2 different views. One view is that the inherent power is not limited for the purpose of awarding costs by the provisions of section 35 and 35A of the code. But it also says that it is more sound a view to think about that the restriction imposed or the limitations and conditions imposed and prescribed in the code must be adhered to. And therefore it says that under section 35 or 35A only a maximum amount of rupees 3000 could be imposed, and the general imposition of the trend of imposing heavy costs of 50,000 or 1 lakh as is made in the PILs or in the administrative law matters, that cannot be imported to civil cases is what the Supreme Court notes in this judgment. It refers to another judgment in the case of Vinod Seth versus Devinder Bajaj, and it says that what is the goal of costs, imposing costs. So it deals with certain goals. It enumerates around 4 or 5 such goals which the very power of imposing costs can achieve. It says it should act as a deterrent to vexatious, frivolous and speculative litigation or defense. Then it says the costs should ensure that the provisions of the code and other laws governing the procedures are scrupulously and strictly complied with, and the litigants do not adopt to delaying tactics or mislead the courts. then the court should provide adequate indemnity to the successful litigant for the expenditure incurred by him for the litigation. The provisions for cost should be an incentive for each litigation to adopt to alternative disputes resolution process and arrive at a settlement before the trial commences. It takes note of the fact that appropriate and adequate provision for costs, the litigants are persuaded to settle nearly 90% of the civil suits before they come up to trial in different countries, is what it has noted. Then it says the provisions relating to cost should not, however, obstruct access to courts and justice. And thus it says that presently the goals are sought to be achieved only by the provisions of section 35, 35A and 35B of the Code of Civil Procedure, which are not so wholly sufficient. Now, sir, I think there are few more topics like issuance of writs and SLP by the Supreme Court. Issuance of writ, I will only point out one small aspect, which is a very interesting reading rather. I want to refer to a judgment in the case of Tilokchand Motichand versus H.B. Munshi. This is reported in 1970, a judgment decided in the year 1968, where the question was whether the Limitation Act applies to the writ petitions under 226 and Article 32. So, firstly, the Supreme Court says that either a person can make either an application under Article 226 to the High Court, or he can make an application to the Supreme Court under Article 32. And this was a case for recovery of certain amount of taxes that were recovered wrongly, and therefore it also takes note that he can also file a suit asking for an appropriate relief. However, it then notes that Article 226 of the Constitution, the courts have a discretion and may, in suitable cases, refuse to give the relief to the person approaching it, even though on the merits the applicant has a substantial complaint as regards violation of a fundamental right. So, Article 226, it is held, even on merits, if he has proved something, still the court may refuse to grant the relief and may relegate him to the civil court. But on the question of delay, the Supreme Court says, on the question of delay, we see no reason to hold that a different test ought to be applied when a party comes to this court under Article 32 from one applicable to the applications under Article 226. It says there is a public policy behind all statutes of limitation. But before it speaks about the refusal of the grant of relief under Article 32 on the basis of bar of limitation, it also says that maximum, it speaks about the fact that approaching the Supreme Court under Article 32 is a fundamental right, and therefore wherever it is established that the fundamental right is violated, then it becomes a duty of the Supreme Court to issue writ, and it no more remains a discretion. Whereas under Article 226, despite the complainant proving or establishing that his fundamental right is violated, the court under Article 226 can still say that in its discretion it is refusing to issue a writ for certain other reasons like limitation. However, under Article 32 it may not. But then the debate continued with regard to whether a party can be said to have waived his fundamental right and then the Supreme Court makes that debate further. It says that the fundamental rights can be said to have been waived in certain circumstances, and it says it could not be said to have been waived in certain other circumstances. But it says the fundamental right of a petitioner has been infringed, and it is not only the right but the duty of the courts under 32 to afford relief to him by passing appropriate orders in that behalf. It says to afford relief to him, it says to move this court under Article 32 is itself a fundamental right, and the same cannot be circumscribed or curtailed except as provided by the Constitution. A duty is imposed by the Constitution, and that cannot be compared with the discretionary powers. The anxiety of this court not to whittle down the amplitude of the fundamental rights guaranteed has found expression in several of its judgments. It has not allowed its vision to be blurred by the fact that some of the persons who invoked its powers had no equity in their favor. So it has gone to the extent of saying that even if a person has no equity in his favor, still under Article 32, wherever there is violation of a fundamental right, the equity would lose its importance, and the court is duty bound to issue writs. It says a right to approach this court under Article 32 is a fundamental right. Then It also takes note of this fact that in that respect, our constitution makes a welcome departure from many other similar constitutions. As seen earlier, a party aggrieved by the infringement of any of its fundamental rights has a right to get relief at the hands of this court, and this court has a duty to grant appropriate reliefs. It refers to Joseph Pothen versus the state of Kerala. The power conferred on this court by that article is not a discretionary power. This power is not similar to the power conferred on the High Court under Article 226 of the Constitution of India. This is how the Supreme Court has expressed with regard to that. With regard to Article 136, while issuing the special leave to appeal, the Supreme Court says that it cannot be equated with the ordinary remedy of appeal as of right under any provision of law. It says Article 136 is an extraordinary right conferred under the Constitution within the discretion of the Supreme Court. It says it is a basic principle of administration of justice that like cases should be decided alike. It is a very sound rule and practice, otherwise on same question of law or same set of facts, different persons approaching a court can get different orders. So noting this, it says that the leave could be granted as a matter of discretion conferred on the court and not as a right that the party can avail. In another judgment in the case of SG Chemical and Dyes Trading versus SG Trading reported in 1986, the powers of the Supreme Court under Article 136 are described, and it said that the powers are very wide, but clause 1 of that article itself states that the grant of SLP is in the discretion of the court. Therefore, it says that Article 136 is not designed to permit direct access to this court where other equally efficacious remedy is available and where the question is not of public importance. So the criteria seems to be that the question before the court proposed in the SLP must be one of public importance and not of a lesser importance. Therefore, a plenary discretion vests is what vests with the Supreme Court in grant or refusal of the leave, is what is again stated in Sitaram versus State of UP, reported in 1979. And similar observations are made in another judgment in the case of Chandi Prasad Chokhani versus State of Bihar, which is reported in 1961, where it says it is the question before us is not whether we have the power. It says undoubtedly we have the power, but the question is whether in the circumstances under present consideration it is a proper exercise of discretion to allow the appellant to have resort to the power of this court. So it ultimately says this question must be decided on the facts of each case. So here the Supreme Court says we will have the unbridled discretion to decide whether to grant or refuse leave based on the circumstances and facts of each particular case. And then the only uniform standard which in our opinion can be laid down in the circumstances is that the court should grant special leave to appeal only in those cases where special circumstances are shown to exist. Generally speaking, this court will not grant special leave unless it is shown that exceptional and special circumstances exist, that substantial and grave injustice has been done, and that the case in question presents features of sufficient gravity to warrant a review of the decision appealed against. Then referring to various other judgments in the case of Pritam Singh, then Dhakeshwari Cotton Mills and other cases, it says sparingly and with caution and only in special and extraordinary circumstances we will exercise this power to grant leave, not only in civil matters but also in criminal and other such matters. And finally it says that this court has uniformly held that there must be exceptional and special circumstance to justify the exercise of discretion under Article 136. In Rajendra Diwan versus Pradeep Kumar Ranibala, this is a judgment of the year 2019 by Justice Mrs. Banerjee, where again conclusiveness or finality given by a statute to decisions of a court or tribunal cannot deter the Supreme Court from exercising this jurisdiction under Article 136 is what is held by the Supreme Court. So like the interpretation of Article 226, where certain statutes say that the orders of the authorities thereunder attain finality, despite that the power under Article 226 is still available to the High Court. Similarly, under Article 136, the Supreme Court has held that despite conclusiveness or finality given by a statute on the decision of a particular court or tribunal, the Supreme Court can still grant leave and hear the appeal against such order. It says where substantial questions of law or questions of public importance are involved, or where there is any uncertainty in the law, the Supreme Court, in its discretion, settles the law. This is what the Supreme Court speaks about, Article 136. With regard to specific reliefs, one of the reliefs is declaration of status or title in suits, injunctions, and grant of specific relief for performance of an agreement or a contract. So far as injunctions is concerned, it is already spoken to by other speakers, and whatever relevant points I had to state, I have already stated. With regard to declaration, I need to only state that again declaration is stated to be a discretionary power of the court, and it is stated in the executive committee of Vaish Degree College versus Lakshmi Narayan, reported in 1976 Supreme Court, that the grant of specific relief under section 20 and section 34 of the Specific Relief Act, as well as under the common law, is purely discretionary and can be refused where the ends of justice do not require the relief to be granted. The exercise of discretion applies as much to a court exercising writ jurisdiction as well as in suits. So they have equated the same discretion that the writ courts exercise is applicable to courts which are granting reliefs under section 34 and section 20. And then again the Latin phrase of ex debito justitiae is what is the underlying principle when discretion is being exercised. In K.S. Vaidyanathan versus Vairavan, that is a 1997 judgment of the Supreme Court, it refers to the earlier the judgments of different countries. In the case of Lindsay Petroleum Company versus Prosper Armstrong, then it refers to a doctrine which is narrated by Sir Barnes Peacock. It says, where it would be practically unjust to give a remedy either because the party has by his conduct done that which might fairly be regarded as equivalent to a waiver of it, or where by his conduct and neglect he has, though perhaps not waiving that remedy, yet put the other party in a situation in which it would not be reasonable to place him if the remedy were afterwards to be asserted. In either of these cases, lapse of time and delay are most material. Then it refers to the commentary of Fry on specific performance, and finally the judgments of England in the case with regard to delay and latches, and then culls out certain principles with regard to exercise of discretionary power vis-a-vis the delay or latches in the case. With regard, this is in section 20 of the Specific Relief Act has been amended recently, and therefore any amount of discussion on section 20, the unamended section 20, may not be so relevant or important right now, and to discuss on the amended provisions of section 20 would be really not required as of now, because we have hardly some material to discuss on that so far as judicial principles are concerned. Let us treat that as a separate part altogether for another discussion. Now, the last topic which I was talking about is the discretionary order of interim orders of stay by the appellate courts. Now, this is where most of the advocates we excel. Our day-to-day success is dependent on this exercise of discretion by the courts. I will refer to a judgment of the Supreme Court in Atmaram Properties versus Messrs. Federal Motors, which is reported in the year 2010, and certain guidelines are given there as to when the courts will grant the interim order of stay and when it will refuse to. I don't think it is necessary now to elaborate on this topic, because it's already more than 1 hour that I have been speaking, and I have tested your patience too long. So the conclusion which I want to make is that the courts have been giving certain guidelines here and there. All these guidelines will ultimately depend upon the judges who are sitting at the helm of the affairs and are deciding on the philosophy of the society in which the society has to march, based on how the society has already marched till now. Now, whether those philosophies are the ones which the parliamentarians want us to follow, parliamentarians want the society to follow or not, is not known to anyone, because the parliamentarians have not stepped into to provide any rule in writing to either accept or to comment upon these guiding factors which the courts through their judicial pronouncements have stated. Now, these philosophies may be a set of advocates altogether, the entire community of advocates may feel that the society should go in this fashion or in this way, in which the guidelines, keeping in mind which the guidelines have been formulated. But then the community of advocates or the community who is dealing with judiciary alone is not the only community which is existing in the society. We have voted the parliamentarians, and the constitution gives the primary power on the legislature to pass certain statutes, and therefore my conclusion is that any number of guidelines given by the judicial pronouncements would not be sufficient to guide the courts, because ultimately the power of legislation has to be exercised by the legislature, and it is only through legislation where the society can be deviated from a wrong direction and can be brought into a right direction if at all the legislature feels so. And therefore the ultimate effort of the advocates in their discussions and in their arguments should be to see what is the intention of the legislature and the spirit of the constitution to bring the society and to take the march ahead as per the spirit of the constitution, and thereafter to cull out philosophies in consonance with, and in tone and tune with, and in frequency with the spirit of the constitution. And if we are going back to English or American jurisprudence to find out how the law should be taken ahead without taking into account the spirit of the constitution or the philosophy underlying the constitution of India, then probably we may err at some point of time in one or the other aspects of law. Therefore, this is what I feel is required to be considered and discussed with everyone. Thanks everyone for this patience, and I am sure I have bored all of you, but then I was helpless, sir. The topic itself was one such thing.